How does IQ test actually work? It compares how well you do on a specific set of puzzles compared to the average of people the same age as you. These tests are constantly recalibrated. For example, kids these days are pretty good at some of those compared to kids 100 years ago. So using the old tests, kids would now score something like 110 or 120 on average. A score 100 means you're better at these puzzles than the average person from your generation. A score 100 means you're worse than them. But since the puzzles are often pretty similar between tests, you can actually practice this kind of sequence completion and increase your score this way. To follow up on this, are there actually any free online IQ tests available? None that are legitimate. No. Because they must be administered by a trained professional. Also because if the test is not proctored, it's easy to cheat. Such tests can indicate if you scored high. That further professional testing might be helpful. The Mensa Society offers proctored tests. Online tests also have an incentive to give people high scores. It's more likely that they become happy with the test/website and tell people about it or go there again for other tests. I'm a preschool level school psychologist. I regularly give IQ tests to 5-year-olds. In case anyone is curious, here is how I actually explain IQ tests to 5-year-olds. We're gonna play some games that will tell me how your brain works. Some people's brains think best with pictures, some with words, some with sounds. Everyone's brain is different, and that is what makes us special. We are going to see how your brain works best so we can make it easier for you to learn at school. All you need to do is just try your best. Do you have any questions? I have a similar job. This is exactly how I explain it to kids and most of the parents. Source: I've actually taken an IQ test. Functionally, you're asked to perform a variety of tasks that test various abilities, general knowledge, through questions, hand-to-eye coordination, short and long-term memory, language, among other things. There were generally 2 tests per area. One test I remember involved the examiner giving you 2 words, at which point you were asked to point out the commonalities between both of them. For example, blue and red are both colors. An IQ test takes about 1 to 2 hours to complete. As far as I know, your results are used to compute a score for each tested ability, which are then used to find an overall IQ score. One thing I will point out: as a society, we've grown to see IQ tests as not much more than a tool used for gloating, as a way to measure intelligence in some form or another. The reality is that IQ tests are important medical tools which can be used to find out and quantify developmental issues in people. Intelligence may be a debatable concept. Short-term memory is not. Alright. A lot of good explanations, but not a lot of explaining like I'm 5. The most popular IQ test is the WISC-V. Usually, these tests are conducted in a one-on-one setting over the course of about 1 to 2 hours. There are multiple subtests which measure intelligence in 5 different ways. Visual spatial, X. Manipulating blocks to match a pattern. Processing speed, X. Figure out a code with a symbol key. Verbal comprehension, X. Vocab knowledge, fluid reasoning, deductive reasoning skills. And working memory, remembering numbers. Based on your score from all the subtests, you add them all up to make a full-scale IQ. Full-scales IQs have an average of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. Meaning that most of the population lies between a score of 85 and 115. Like many people have said, an IQ test is not a representation of someone's complete intelligence. For instance, someone could be a complete genius in painting or music, and the IQ test would never pick that up. However, the IQ test does measure abilities that are correlated with being able to navigate the modern world with success. Source: I am a school psychologist and give IQ tests for a living. I think other people have explained it deeper than me, but I'll give it a shot anyways. We assume recognizing patterns means that you are smart. We then create a series of patterns with one picture missing and ask you to fill it in. If you can recognize the pattern, you are smart. If you cannot recognize the pattern, you are not smart. Keep in mind, as everyone will tell you, IQ doesn't necessarily mean smart, and certainly doesn't mean smart in every sense of the word. People focus on the content of the questions too much. The point is that you come up with questions that have a good distribution. You don't want everyone getting them all right or wrong. You want good variance. Then you give that test to a good population sample and get the distribution of scores from that sample. Then you give the test to other people to see how they fare against the sample. And this ends up being pretty good at predicting some things. The actual questions aren't really all that relevant. The statistics are. A lot of good answers here. But I think the key to keep in mind is to ask the question: what is intelligence? If intelligence is how well or how efficiently you can solve certain puzzles or problems, then our current method for testing and measurement makes sense. But in reality, intelligence is far more complex than that. And thus our manner of measurement is not all that accurate. There's still debate as to how we define intelligence and how we therefore measure it. At the end of the day, we don't have a better solution to this problem, so our current IQ testing is the best we have. But there are some interesting arguments being made for new ways of defining and measuring IQ. Does the test measure anything aside from how good you are at the test itself? I mean, is there any scientific basis that these puzzles are decent proxies for other aspects of cognition? IQ tests tend to be highly correlated with other things that we associate with intelligence. For example, people with higher IQ scores also tend to have higher high school and college GPAs and tend to perform better on job evaluations. Of course, it's debatable whether or not these are accurate measures of intelligence, but it does imply that they are related to IQ. Simple version first. It doesn't work. You can't figure out intelligence this way, because there are so many different kinds of people that come from different places. It's like asking which is the fruitiest, apples or watermelons or grapes. So why are IQ tests important in the first place? What are the results of the test for? In our country, they're mostly used to keep people who aren't white out of colleges. And that's not fair. A mature person version. It doesn't. It also has extremely racist origins and continued negative repercussions for non-whites to this day. The pseudoscience of eugenics gained popularity early in the United States history and led to race-purifying legal restrictions, like outlawing interracial marriage and forcing sterilization of non-whites in the early 1900s. 30 states had laws requiring sterilization of low-grade people. Eugenicists were unable to find a sciencey way to prove their assertions that white people were superior to all other races until 1909. When Alfred Binet came up with an intelligence scale, the precursor to the Stanford-Binet IQ test, and standardized methods to quantify people's brainpower, Nazi Germany snatched it up as a tool in its own campaign to sterilize underperforming individuals. Bottom line: virtually every application of IQ tests is problematic. Binet himself said it was an insufficient method, and walking away from it forever would be a very positive thing to do. An IQ test asks you to answer questions. Those questions aren't supposed to require knowledge, stuff you've learned, but should be things that you can figure out. They will be things like trying to figure out patterns, so you can predict what comes next in a list, figuring out how many shapes are in a picture, etc. Sometimes there's a time component too. How fast can you solve the puzzles? Like a quiz. You get a score, and they compare that score to other people that have taken the same test. They adjust the scores so that they can be compared between other IQ tests. A score of 100 means that you got the average. The scores are adjusted so that 68% of people have a score between 85 and 115. And 95% of people have a score between 70 and 130. Higher numbers mean more intelligent. And lower numbers, less intelligent. It turns out that it's really hard to make a test that doesn't require any knowledge. And some puzzles are similar to things some people have seen before while others haven't experienced. So it's really hard to come up with problems so that you can compare test scores across groups of people with very different backgrounds. It's a series of easy logic puzzles. Like completing a series of numbers or shapes, like 1 2 4 8 underscore. You got a fixed time to solve as many as possible and get some amount of points for each. The same test is done with many people, and then the average result is calculated and defined as 100 IQ points. It's important to mention that IQ tests don't measure what we normally call intelligence, because we don't really understand what that even is. The only thing IQ tests have in common by definition is that they are scored on the same bell curve. So the average IQ is always 100. The tests themselves can therefore vary a lot. But they are usually based on puzzles, as this does not require much language skills or other prior knowledge. So the tests will be better at capturing the true intelligence of a person rather than their skills and knowledge. There are, however, some issues with this approach. Some people might be highly intelligent but still suck at the types of puzzles found in IQ tests. It is also possible to train on the types of puzzles you get in these tests. So these types of tests is best suited for mass if you want to get a rough idea of the intelligence of a large number of people in a simple way. However, they rarely give any good indication of the intelligence of individuals within that group. Some people might be highly intelligent but still suck at the types of puzzles found in IQ tests. There are a wide variety of puzzles. And professionals know how to administer tests to people who aren't used to staring at long series of puzzles on a screen or sheet of paper. It is true that some people do poorly on IQ tests and are reasonably intelligent. Intelligence is not possible to precisely measure or even define. But IQ is strongly correlated with all kinds of ability. Among a group of people with high IQ, most will be successful at any field they study: art, music, math, language. Among a group of people with low IQ, most will be relatively unsuccessful at most subjects, even if they make an effort to study. But there are outliers. Cognition is a mystery. Thanks for the great addition with some more deeper information. There's a lot of good stuff in here by @Proc15 and @Toy-Smith, each explaining different parts of IQ and psychometrics, and the idea that we are as a collective humanity share an experience. Need to put a word to it, and then use it to distinguish and categorize. Like they have both said, it's controversial, and tying personal value to it is common and destructive. However, IQ is commonly tested and used in so many different contexts. Companies use it in the hiring process, Wonderlic, universities use it for admittance, ACT, SAT, GRE, LSAT, etc. The NFL even uses it to test at the combine. As they have both mentioned, it's positively correlated as general intelligence goes up. So do these variables with income, grades, education, and job performance, ranging from small correlations in things like factory work to very strong correlations in things like law, medicine, leadership, more complex tasks. Additionally, which neither of them have covered, there is a ton of research on its relationship with race. It was commonly used in Darwin-Zittig and eugenic arguments about the reasons white people are better. As an off-the-cuff benchmark, generally African Americans score 1 SD, 15 points, below white people. Hispanics score 1/2 SD below whites. And Asians typically score 1/2 above whites. Additionally, women score 1/4 SD above men. There are hundreds of reasons why, and contradictory to what others have said. This is being studied and is still being extensively studied today. Additionally, where G comes from in terms of heritability, learned, shared experiences, and school is still being studied, often using twin studies. For example, your parents' income can predict around 20% of your G score. This is because your parents' income determines the funding your schools get, the quality of food you have growing up, the quality of childcare you receive, the quality of language and goals set by your parents, and myriad of other things. There are so many problematic things with the way we not only test intelligence but also judge others by it. And yet, as seen throughout this thread, there is no clear definition on what it actually measures. An example, the NFL has reduced the gap between races by removing words and creating a visual test. The creators of IQ tests are generally white, educated, and often male. Their language is soaked into these tests. By removing the language, we can reduce the barriers others may have present in their scores. Additionally, there are thousands of sources on this coming out every year. A good researcher to start with is James L. Outs. And using key terms like intelligence and adverse impact will gain you more traction on any research you do on your own. It measures how many related things your mind can handle at the same time. Imagine a juggler. A bad juggler will have trouble working with 2 balls at the same time, and it will be impossible for him to handle 4 or 5. While a good juggler will keep 9 or 10 in the air with no problem. The mind is the same. A good mind can handle many related things at the same time, and will see the world from many different angles. And bad one only can handle 2 or 3 at the same time, and will see the world in very simple terms. Black and white. One thing or the other. That is what IQ measures. It keeps adding balls for you to juggle until your mind can't handle it anymore. The more balls you can handle at the same time, the higher your score and the better your mind is. There is a brilliant series of Radiolab podcasts about this which I'm too lazy to look up. But they go into this in depth. They show you pictures and see if you can spot the patterns/differences. Then they give you a score relative to your peers where 100 is average, and you go up or down from that midpoint. Obviously, your ability to see patterns/differences in pictures is not the full measure of your intelligence, but it is fairly predictive of things like educational attainment and income. It's pattern recognition and memorization. Tests how fast you learn things and if you retain the information learned. They are standardized tests, which means that your score is a measure of different to user from average. It's measured in standard deviations, roughly how much each score differs from the average, with 15 IQ points being 1 SD up or down. Thus IQ 85 and 115 are equally unusual, the range between them comprising about 60% of the population. This should make it clear why talk of E, G, and AI having an IQ of 1000s is nonsense. IQ isn't like height. It's only a measure of relative performance. And you need to compare it to a population. You standardize a test of questions/puzzles by getting people of all ages to take it. You eventually get an average score. 1 standard deviation. 2 standard deviations. Etc. These deviations and averages provide a way for test takers to see where they stand among their age cohort. For example, in X minutes, the average 19-year-old will get 30 out of 50 questions correct. If the same 19-year-old scored 40 out of the 50 questions correct, they would score higher than X percentage of other test takers. These scores are essentially your IQ. I studied this briefly in school. Now I don't know the particulars for each type of IQ test, because frankly they and the people who love them are generally pretty useless. But the concept is as simple as this. If you make 100 questions about pretty much anything that requires abstraction and administer the test to a sufficiently large population, you will get a bell grade distribution for how many you answered correctly. IQ points like 140 or something is a completely made-up nothing number. It's not nonsensical, it's weighted averages, standard deviations, etc. averaged on 100. But what is useful, and where the idea comes from, is the percentile in which you scored for the same test as all the other people. It is truly as simple as that. And the truly remarkable phenomena is that it is reproducible and predictable to very high levels of correlation. God made winners and losers a real thing. PhD psychometric in here. I'll add something, but explaining IQ tests to a 5-year-old is not possible. Exams in general are designed to measure an ability in a certain topic area that falls somewhere along the continuum of aptitude and achievement. Aptitude is basically your potential, and achievement is what you've learned. IQ tests are supposed to be 100% an aptitude test. In a perfect world, you should never be able to study and get a higher score on an IQ test. In reality, creating IQ tests that only measure aptitude is impossible. So just because you got a higher score than someone else, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are inherently smarter than that person. You get asked many questions at the beginning of the test like: recite person, woman, man, camera, TV. About 15 minutes later you'll be asked to recite in the same order: person, woman, man, camera, TV. If you get them all correct, it means you're an uber genius and can possibly run for POTUS. That's just one test that I know of. /S. I'm a speech therapist / pathologist, so in my line of work I tend to think about 1. Verbal skills, 2. Nonverbal or cognitive skills. So I might do lots of assessments to see what a child understands, how they use words and sentences and grammar when they speak, and how clear their sounds are. I can get a score which compares them against other children their age. Then I might ask an educational psychologist to do some IQ tasks which look at non-language skills, like copying shapes built from cubes. This allows me to compare those scores. It is possible for a child to have language skills below the 1st percentile, but have cognitive skills in the 100th percentile. I know then that if I do a lot of therapy, we should aim to bring their language scores right up. So IQ can look at lots of different skill areas, and it can change in childhood with interventions.